Not been to a NYPAY event before. Wow, this is good. This is always nice. So, I'll just talk real quickly. NYPAY was put together in 2006, probably. The idea was that it's fun to have a place where you can talk about things going on. It start off kind of in payments, when payments was kind of boring. It was just issue cards and all that kind of stuff. And then it kind of morphed and overlapped a little bit with fintech as things started getting more and more interesting. So we have events probably 10 times a year. The idea is to just do this, get together a group of people you can network and learn about something. So there's a few kind of rules that go on in NYPAY, generally rules. One is that first ask questions. This is not meant to be just people up here talking. It's interactive. You can go watch some of our videos on our YouTube channel to see how interactive it can get depending on the topic. And the second one I'll just say is that acronyms can be a bane of existence. You think of the conversations we've all been in our professional careers where we understood the verbs and we understood the articles, but not the nouns. So if you use an acronym without explaining it first, you get chastised. So just keep that in mind. And that's kind of the only groundwork. So we got a wonderful topic here. My colleague from NYPAY, Taylor Bez, is very passionate about this. We all, in some way, connect with the healthcare system, and whether we're a practitioner receiving funds or we're having to try to figure out what the hell the bill's all about and why do we have to pay so much. So there's a lot to talk about, and rather than me blathering on, I will turn things over to Tay.
Thanks, David. Welcome, everyone. And before anybody forgets it, you are all welcome to join NYPAY and join our events committee to help put together future events. So it's 2018. Most of the world has gone digital. Most of the payment space has gone digital, with one glaring exception: healthcare payments. Over 75% of healthcare payments are still on paper, which is unreal. That's the US. Overseas, it's another story. And we're looking at this adds to cost, adds to patient confusion, adds to provider confusion, adds to over $75 billion in unpaid medical bills. That says two things. One, the US fragmented healthcare system presents unusual challenges, unusual difficulties in going electronic. There's something else, though. With trillions of dollars in payments, it says there's a lot of opportunity for the payments companies and the fintech companies that can figure out how to get the industry to move. So we have an expert panel that's going to address both the challenges and the opportunities. And I'm going to ask them to each introduce themselves and to tell us a little bit about their company. So, Hanu Koski from BBK Worldwide. Hanu?
So we are specialized in the clinical trial space. So it's kind of a niche within the healthcare. We are essentially, our heritage is being a marketing agency, but over the last couple of years, we have also added a payment product to our product portfolio. So excited to be here and talk about the payments and clinical trials.
Next to him is Henri Cartier.
Henry Cartier.
From Commonwealth Healthcare Advisors.
Right. Good evening, Henry Cartier, and so our firm is Commonwealth Health Advisors. We're up in Boston. We are a healthcare technology and consultancy. We work with organizations that are selling into providers, payers, digital health companies. But one of the hottest markets is healthcare payment segment. So we've had a good chance to work with several companies that are innovating in the space, as well as helping investors look at this segment and decide which of the the bets and what are the companies that are most likely to be successful disrupting, which is what Ted mentioned, a very paper-intensive business today.
And his colleague David Stevater.
Thank you. And Henry already mentioned I'm also from Commonwealth Health Advisors. A little bit about our firm. We work exclusively with healthcare tech and services companies, with boards and CEOs and investors trying to think about where to place their bets. And we work with companies that sell to payers, primarily payers and providers. My background is that I've been in the healthcare space for the last 20 years. A good chunk of it with life sciences, so I'm familiar with the clinical trial space, although most of my time was spent on the commercial side, but you can't help but get to understand the trials that the drugs have to go through in order to actually get to market and some of those challenges. I worked at Athena Health with Henry for 7+ years, and I have a lot of experience in the revenue cycle side and the challenges there. As Henry said, there are all kinds of challenges, but it takes out all kinds of opportunities with this space, and hopefully we'll get into some. We do definitely want this to be very interactive tonight. We're going to learn from you guys too, so thank you.
Next to him is Jeff Fontaine, who in addition to being with Ingenico, is also the vice chair of the Secure Technology Alliance's Health and Human Services Council. And for those of you who don't quite keep up with organizations, it used to be what?
Smart Card Alliance.
The Smart Card Alliance.
Were you at Hamburger Central last week?
I was not, unfortunately.
This is a wonderful organization that several of us are part of, which brings together various parties. It's not an advocacy group, but it brings together parties in different parts of the payments world, the technology providers, the issuers, the networks, to really talk about problems and figure them out. And so this is clearly an issue in this space, which is why we're having the panel.
So Jeff, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and about Ingenico?
Absolutely. So good evening, and thank you to NYPAY for having us. Thank you all for attending. So Ingenico, you probably know us as a terminal manufacturer. So if you walk into your Home Depots, your Walmarts, you're actually placing your credit card into an Ingenico payment terminal. But truthfully, we're really so much more than that. And in particular in healthcare, there's really 3 avenues that we're very much focused on. First is patient payments. And so we'll talk probably a great deal about patient payments today, and hopefully you have a number of questions regarding that. We're also looking at things like patient identification and how can we really solve some of the challenges that surround the identity of patients. And then third, how do we really solve for some of the challenges of patient engagement? Right? So there's so many tentacles, I use that word tentacles, in the healthcare market. And patient engagement is one of those. And there's really an opportunity, there's a challenge I think we'll all agree to solve for some of those areas in terms of how we engage a patient throughout the process of care. So those are 3 things that Ingenico is very much focused on and what we're trying to drive to in terms of solutions.
Jeff, you've had experience in Europe as well as the U.S. Why is the U.S. so far behind other countries when it comes to
That's probably a session all to itself, right? Everyone would agree. I think it's just the reality of our market. Right? You have a private sector and you have a public sector, and these 2 are colliding. And there's so many different solutions, so many different opportunities to solve the many challenges that span the healthcare continuum. And I think that's a little bit different when you get to some of these other countries. I've had the fortune to travel to a number of countries in a prior position, spent time in China and Europe and South America, and seen a number of these different healthcare systems. We're incredibly unique. I mean, we really are. There's aspects that are common with other markets, but the reality is we're unique with this private public sector environment. And so that's one of the challenges that we have to solve across those 3 areas that I referenced, whether we're engaging, whether we're paying, or whether we're identifying the patient. And those are challenges that are unique to our market, different from what's happening in Europe.
Henry, do you want to jump in?
On the topic of the U.S. market?
Why the U.S. is so far behind?
Well, I think Jeff really covered the biggest dynamic is we are largely still, a public market, and the commercial payers do not always cooperate with each other, and thinking about the consumer is not been on top of their list. The reality is, and this is remarkable, and in the last 10 years, the amount of receivables that doctors now have from consumers is now 30%. 10, 15 years ago, it was about 10%. So, the amount of stress placed on hospitals and provider organizations of all stripes based on this, share shift to consumers is really unique to the U.S. market. And it's only become more exacerbated, more unique to the U.S. market versus what you see internationally. So I would think that the U.S. market has become more different than the rest of the globe versus more. So
just a metric question, is that mainly through hospital care as opposed to like primary care, that shift? So in other words, is the 30% more from inpatient,
Yeah, it's driven by employers basically moving and changing the health benefits to their employees, right? So this correlates totally with the growth of high deductible health plans in the last 20 or 30 years with, $6,000 out of pockets for consumers.
So would also if primary care physicians who are out of hospital.
They're out of hospital.
Wherever you're getting,
Wherever
care,
you're
however
care.
you're spending on your care.
And
So how are you handling that problem for providers? How do you start to handle getting patients who are already paying a lot more for their insurance to then also pay a lot more for their services?
Yeah, I'll jump in and I think y'all have some perspectives. I think that's, so if I was to draw this out on a whiteboard, you would think about, the engagement process, you would think about the identity process and then the payment process. Well, think about the engagement process, right? There's an opportunity to, as you book an appointment, as you seek treatment, there's a way to engage you up front to make sure that we've got all the right demographics about you. We have all the right information relative to your insurance. We're able to predict or accurately define what your patient responsibility would be. So patient responsibility is your portion of the payment, right? Whether you're on a high deductible health plan and you're on some sort of copay, if they have that information up front because they're engaging you, say, pre-appointment, now they can accurately predict the amount that you're going to owe. And then there's an opportunity even in that engagement process to capture that before you potentially step in the facility, right? You go ahead and do a mobile payment on your phone as you're in the subway heading to the doctor's office, right? To go ahead and satisfy that, to streamline your process when you're inside of the facility, right? There's an identity aspect, right? So when you come into that facility, you have to identify who you are and provide information. If you did not do all of that pre-engagement that I described. And then once they've identified you and accurately predicted, say, that copay or that responsibility, now they have to come up with software tools and connectivity to our devices to capture that payment and deploy that in a way that they can do that at time of service, right at the very end, right? So you walk out, the doctor said, okay, I'll send your prescription to the local pharmacy. They walk you to the front desk, and now you're going to complete your payment, right? There's a whole ecosystem of companies, probably some of you in this room are familiar with them, that are solving for those challenges. So it's each step in that continuum that there's opportunities to solution and address those challenges that are unique to each position in that continuum.
I mean, I would just add to that, we break the components of the payments model, if you will, down into three pieces: pre-service, point of service, and post-service. And typically we've heard of practices looking at the point of service as an opportunity to collect a copay or the portion of the deductible, and so there's tactics that are underway to try to help patients understand at least then what they owe, if there's an ability to estimate it. And then post-service is where most of the action has been. I mean, that's really where you go send a bill to the patient, or you send them, if you're an advanced organization, you send them a text message. That's actually advanced today. And there's other ways through phone service and whatnot, call centers, to do that. Now, a lot of the action is moving to the pre-service side to try to estimate before the patient comes in, give them some idea, especially, there is a big difference between walking into your doctor's office for a primary care visit. For a preventative care, for example, is mostly free now with high deductible health plans. And what we really worry about is big surgeries and unexpected care through emergency care. Those are the things that are actually really hitting people hard, especially when your plan does not cover anything out of network. And so those are really hard things to help people prepare for. I mean, the question is, how do you help patients with that? That's really where a lot of the action is right now on the pre-service side, if you have something planned. And then really, the plan sponsors have an obligation to do more to educate their plan members about how to manage the unexpected healthcare costs.
So you talked about in-network, out-of-network, and patients do get hit by surprise with out-of-network charges. Are any of you addressing that, where the hospital can be alerted to providing in-network service? Was anybody out there doing that? Because that would be one of the opportunities, both to keep costs down and so that patients don't incur huge bills they can't pay.
Well, I mean, one thing I'll say is that a lot of states have enacted legislation to prevent hospitals from balance billing patients. As everyone's familiar with balance billing is. Yeah, so balance billing is basically, if you go out of network, it's mostly an out of network phenomenon where the hospital will effectively try to bill the patient for the amount that the insurance company won't cover. And the insurance company will typically try to say, I don't really cover very much because it was out of network, and they'll do their negotiation in their dance, and then they'll try to hit the patient with the rest. And the hospital's working off of a very high charge because there's nothing pre-negotiated with the plan. And so a number of states have actually put laws in place where those hospitals, in certain emergency situations, not for routine care, are prohibited from actually sending a patient a bill for the remainder. That's the balance bill part.
Well, let me just think it a little bit more, because you said it's a high charge because nothing's been pre-negotiated, but this is not anything connected to cost of service. This is just whatever they agreed the billable rate was.
No, there was no billable rate in a sense because there's no agreement in place between the payer, in this case, or the plan, and that provider because the patient went out of network. So there is no, for that particular patient, for that episode of care, there is nothing pre-negotiated between the plan and that provider for that patient. So there's no rate, there's no pre-negotiated rate schedule. So what the provider will do is hit the patient through the plan with their full charge.
Yeah.
100,000. I mean, you guys have read these stories. There was one in the news recently. I think Chrissy Farr, somebody at CNBC picked it up, where the person in a Texas emergency room was hit with a bill for like $100,000, and because it was out of network, because it hit the news, and they ended up not wanting any more bad press. The hospital ended up walking it back and sending the patient a bill for like $885.
So that raises an interesting question though about those rack rates, those negotiated rates. Are they just whatever we can get?
Yeah, pretty much.
So
There's
they,
no basis in
they,
cost reality.
they have nothing related to any cost or expense. It's just so that's a bizarro fiction that exists in this medical care world.
Yeah, Steve Brill wrote a huge New York Times 20,000 word essay, or not essay, but report. Steve Brill.
Oh, Brill,
Time
okay,
magazine, all about the
There's a
hospital charge
question right
master.
behind David.
Yeah, so in terms of estimation, do you think that could discourage patients from going to the visit at all and could lead to more long-term, more costly issues down the line?
The question is that if the patient learns about the charges ahead of time, would that lead them to defer going for treatment or put it off until something more serious develops, raising costs in the long run? Who would like to take that?
Sure.
I'm always happy to answer. Go ahead.
Well, yeah, I love your perspective as well. I mean, I think the answer is yes, certainly. Sticker shock, right, can discourage a lot of folks from doing something, whether it's, buying a car or seeking healthcare treatment. I think from my perspective, as my business is engaging with a number of software companies that are focusing in addressing some of those challenges, is being able to present payment plans, right, to those particular patients because they're able to score their ability to say pay, what we call propensity to pay in the healthcare space. Right? So they're basically assigning a score to you about your ability to pay a certain charge that they may present.
So it's almost like risk modeling the credit card world, where you say,
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Now, the flip side is there's greater transparency for what that cost is than ever before for the consumer. So yes, the payment plan may be a deterrent for you doing the procedure, but if you know what provider X is going to charge, you can probably shop provider Y, Z, and L much easier than you could have 5 to 10 years ago. So there are companies like Castlight, Healthcare Blue Book, and others that are doing nothing but healthcare transparency because the consumer, based on the insurance plans, has that liability or has that responsibility for the first 6, 10 thousand.
so are there companies then that allow provide a marketplace to shop? Is that Castlight designer then?
So,
Liv?
can I just add one thing to that? Not all of it is cost-based, it's outcomes-based. It's what success will I have with provider 1 or provider 2 or hospital A or hospital B. It's not solely cost.
That's what we
That transparency should be where can I get the
Outcomes.
procedure and have a much more successful outcome.
Good
So-
point.
I want to go back to the question of digitalization. With a chip in Europe, you can put a whole health insurance plan, a whole formulary on a smart card or a smartphone. Why can't we use that here so if a patient is going to the hospital knows what's in network and covered by insurance and what's not, or the doctor knows?
Well, for the most part, hospitals know. And it gets back to the question that you asked. I mean, there's really 2 reasons that patients are in a hospital. One is unplanned and the other is planned. For the planned, for the most part, it depends on the plan design, but there's a lot of prior authorization that happens where everything has to be pre-approved, and much of what, I mean, there are very few hospitals, there's certainly some, but most hospitals include as a part of their intake for the patient, financial counseling, and providing of options for payment plans. So it's not usually for planned admissions, there's not usually as much of a financial surprise, although there can be. It's the unplanned that are really the problem. And that's so much of what you hear about in the news, whether you realize it or not, much of that is written about as the emergency or the unplanned. So there's those aspects to keep in mind as well.
Staying with hospitals, this is personal pet peeve. But if you are a patient in a hospital, even with good insurance, for 2 or 3 day stay can generate a huge bill, at least on paper. Thing is, you don't get just one piece of paper with a bill. You get a little bill here, and then you pay something, whatever your copay is, and then in a week or two there's another bill, and then there's another one, and it can keep coming for months and months. Most of it has codes. You don't know whether you really got the service or not. So patients are really confused, and I would guess that sort of it's a demotivator when it comes to paying those copay charges. What can be done about that? Who's got a
Complicated
solution?
hospital bill.
The endless hospital bill.
Well, I mean, there are services that are, even the EHRs themselves, like Epic, are trying to do more across providers and for a whole family's care within a system to provide a simpler billing experience. My experience is it's simple. It's still not simpler. I mean, it takes a lot of work to streamline the way you provide the appearance of something to make it simple to understand, and nothing about healthcare costs or how you would present it is simple to start with. What is an allowable median? You know, I mean, there's all these pieces of information that are provided on EOBs. What is even an EOB? Patients don't even understand what any of this stuff is. You know, so we've complicated the system so much that even if you started breaking it down in more digestible chunks, there's still so much information. What's the difference between a professional charge and a facility charge? You know, every time you go to the hospital, you get bills from the doctors and you get bills from the hospital. And sometimes the hospital includes the doctor charges for doctors that are part of the hospital, but not doctors who are not part. I don't know that there's a simple answer to that question. I don't know that anybody's really taken that on, except hospitals that use Epic are maybe trying to do this one bill. And there are revenue cycle companies that are trying to make it simpler, but there's not a huge incentive out there for them to spend a lot of that. Epic is the billing and the EHR system for a lot of health systems, along with Cerner, Meditech, Allscripts. There's a number of different names.
You know, I'll just quickly comment that I think there's an analogy to when you take your car to the dealership. So fortunately, I did take my wife's car last week to the dealership. And there were 3 or 4 service items that were going to be done on that vehicle, right? And so as I get the car back, and I'm now handed about 7 pieces of paper, and as I start to scroll through those pieces of paper, there's all sorts of codes, there's all sorts of descriptions, and I have zero idea what was done. All I know is I got in the car, I turned it on, and it was working in the way that it should work versus how I presented it to the dealer, right? And I think that's analogous to the healthcare space in terms of the bills that they receive. I think there's one, let me just real quick, I think there's one added complexity that we don't think about if we think about the car dealership. Imagine that you had to pay the mechanic separately from the car dealership, right? Imagine that you had to pay the parts separately from the car dealership. And oftentimes that's what happens in healthcare, right? Say the anesthesiologist that was performing your anesthesia during the surgery. If they're not part of the hospital system, you're going to get a separate bill from the anesthesiologist, right? And so those are the complexities I don't think we as consumers do enough for ourselves to educate ourselves about that complexity of the healthcare market. I think we need to take some of that burden and own that and do better when we're consuming healthcare.
Yet even with that complexity, there's still no third party involved in your scenario with the car dealership, unless it's warranty work and then the manufacturer stepping in and taking it. And unlike a patient that walks out of a doctor's office or out of a hospital, you're not driving away with your car unless you make the payment.
Very true. Yeah.
So it's a great analogy, but even still,
There's more complexity.
there's more to it.
Absolutely.
Guys, can you speak up when you ask a question so the people in the back can hear?
Yeah.
So
Sure.
in front of
I
you.
was just going to challenge what you said earlier about consumers needing to take more responsibility for doing their homework and understanding all of the bills, because of course I'm sure most people in here have a college degree, likely a master's, maybe a doctorate, but most working Americans who receive bills from their insurance don't, and they don't have that healthcare literacy. And so while there is some modicum of personal responsibility, there's also that, folks can't do what they can't do, and then what?
And that's fair, and I think that presents an opportunity, right? I think there are companies that maybe haven't innovated enough in that space that can step into that to help address the challenges you say. There's a wide market of people that probably don't and will not fully understand what they're consuming in terms of healthcare. So are there folks that can step into that? And I think there's probably some startups that are absolutely trying to solve for those challenges. They're just so widely distributed that we don't quite know about them just yet. But I think we're going to get better and better. That's a fair point, absolutely.
When you add something like Medicare fee-for-service, there are over 7,000 codes for treatments. That's not including the diagnostic codes. That's just treatment codes. Stephanie.
I totally understand what you're saying, that we need to be more educated as patients. But my question is, how do we get that education? Where's the list? I'm lucky I've never had surgery, but it wouldn't even occur to me to ask ahead of time, oh, does the anesthesiologist work through the hospital or is he private? So I don't know where that list is that I can help to educate myself.
Well, it gets to the fractured nature of our system, and we talk about this a lot in the work we do with our clients. And it often comes down to who can, this isn't going to sound like the right word, who owns the patient? Who owns the patient relationship? Is it the provider? Is it the payer? Is it the employer? Or who often has the employee as their plan member? It's really complicated the way our system is constructed. And, we dealt with this a lot at Athena Health, and in the way in which we at Athena attempted to build financial incentives in some places, just for something as simple as sending patient demographic information from one provider to another provider for purposes of a specialty referral, for example. There really is no incentive for the primary care doctor to send what we would call a clean order to the specialty doctor, because the primary care doctor is not really getting anything out of it. It takes some time to do it, and so it doesn't really work. What we came up with at Athena is that we thought the specialty provider that was getting the referral should actually pay something, not for a referral, that's illegal, but at least for the clean order is how we termed it. And we ended up with an OIG opinion that said that's actually okay, because you're sending the kind of information to where it needs to be and when it needs to be. So until you injected that financial incentive into the system, the right behaviors really often don't happen in the healthcare system.
Just to make sure I've got it, a clean order means?
Clean order means, this was probably Athena jargon a little bit, but the clean order is it's patient demographics, it's the doctor's notes that include a little bit more information about why am I sending you this patient. It's where is the patient's, where's the primary care doctor located. It's basic information that would go from
be captured by the primary care and is not necessarily transmitted to the.
That's correct.
specialist.
That's correct. To the specialist. It's really amazing how little information goes to the specialist about why that patient's even showing up.
Is that an aspect of why people get tested sometimes for the same thing?
Absolutely.
We should hold portable
Never
electronic medical records for a little bit later, but you had your hand up, and then I want to come up with another.
Yes, please, just to tie two threads together, the
The
question
ladder.
from the young lady before and the comment by Henri earlier about the Time article.
Use your bar voice.
When you look at it, short of purposeful obfuscation, right, the normal healthcare consumer, Mr. and Mrs. Sausagehead out there, they really don't know what to ask and what to challenge. And to your point in the Time article, to David's question, CMS reimburses $12 on a typical lipid blood panel, which if you went in and were charged without insurance off the charge record, you would be charged $300 for. So unless you know enough to go back in and challenge that, you're going to get stuck with a $300 bill. And a lot of, the Make America Great Again people are going to think, okay, I really owe this money. They're not going to try and negotiate the hospital or the provider down. They're going to set up a payment plan and pay it. So I think that the piece around consumer patient education is really huge in consumer-directed healthcare, because short of that, people are going to pay more than they should.
It's an opportunity.
Well said.
Yeah. But again, it gets back to the fractured nature of the system. Who has the incentive to spend the money to educate the patient? You know, everything costs money. Everything is a cost. And one of the challenges with our system is that one party's cost is the profit for another party. It's really complicated to untangle that in our system.
And then that would be one where a central body who would be involved could help a lot. However, we have a systematic aversion to that with the part of the population.
Well, we don't even have a master patient.
We have a,
You know.
I got another question here.
I was just gonna add, in terms of the comment about giving a specialist demographic information, that's one of the benefits of a group of specialists or a group of doctors or a group of hospitals for that matter, being on the same electronic medical record system. Because then it's all there, and if you give them permission, they can get access to everything that the other doctor had said or all the notes and so on. And I've had that experience, and it is just an incredible opportunity for the doctors to see what the other doctors have said or lab tests or what have you.
To the point here, there has been situations where I've been involved personally where they're sitting on an Epic system or they're sitting on Athena Health, and I have twin boys, and one of them has cerebral palsy, so we spent a lot of time in the hospitals. And yet you'll go from one particular specialist within the same hospital structure to the next one, and they keep asking you the same question. I said, why aren't you sitting on an Epic system here? Why aren't you looking through records? And they're not. And to me, that is a huge crack.
Let me go into another diversion.
Just
We
to
can come back to
amplify
this.
something on that though, quickly. The fact is that you're butting up against compliance, both in terms of privacy and personal health
We're going to get
information
into privacy a little
and
bit.
payments and all the regulation that goes along with that. So you're in a perfect storm where the easiest answer is no, we're not going to share information, which is detrimental to the system and certainly to the individual patient.
I want to move into another area of healthcare. It's critically important if we're getting new medications, new drugs, and that's the area of clinical trials. It is, in and of itself, a complex system, particularly those that are running multi-country trials, because you're running into different regulatory regimes, different ethics regimes, different currencies. One of the problems, and they're really pricey to conduct, is retaining patients, keeping the patient enrolled for many months. Sometimes it can be 2 or 3 years. And DBK has developed a payment system that helps with payment retention, and I'd like Hanu to describe that for us.
Yeah, happy to.
Henry, can you put this back on? It seems to have gone off. It was on, it went off. Now it's going to go back on. Did it become unplugged or anything? And there's stuff, all kinds of wires on it. While we're doing that, let's let you hold off for a minute. So I saw another couple of comments or questions. Yeah, in the back.
They were talking earlier about there's no incentive for a primary care physician to transfer the clean referral or the clean document. What about like a patient wallet? If the doctor gives it to the patient, that they could then take it securely to the referring doctor or referred doctor.
Sounds like a great idea. I mean, we are not bereft of good ideas in healthcare, right? I mean, there's probably 120 in this room. The question is, how do you create the right kind of behavior change on the part of the people who need to use them, the providers and patients and other actors in the system? Providers don't want to do anything that they're not either making money for or avoiding paying for. I mean, it sounds like a crass statement, but they're so up against everything from a regulatory, their income statements under assault on every side. So we can have a longer conversation tackle that offline. We can talk more about it here if everybody wants to, but I think there's a lot of good ideas. It's just a matter of how do you get them adopted and create that uptake.
I want to talk about this as a unique solution to a unique problem. Okay?
All right, thank you. So yeah, PPK is a marketing and tech company, and we are specialized in.
I'm here for mic.
Can you hear me? All right. Yep. Now better. So yeah, PPK is a marketing and tech agency specialized in clinical trials. So I wanted to spend a few moments just to give you guys an overview. What is a clinical trial? What are the certain dynamics there? So it's a little bit better, easier then to understand also how the payments work in that space. So clinical trials are basically, this is a short definition of it. They are evaluating the effectiveness and the safety of the new medications and the medical devices for the real human beings. And down the road, the goal is to get the approval from the regulatory body in the US. That regulatory body is FDA. And obviously there's many different stakeholders in a clinical trial. Here are listed some of the key members. Starting from the right-hand side, we have pharmaceutical companies, which are called study sponsors in the clinical trial context. So it's basically their drug, which is investigated. So they are also the ones who are funding the whole process. It's their R&D process, right? Then they are hiring the doctor's offices, investigational sites to really conduct the clinical trials. These are hospitals, private practices, academic centers, and so forth. And then there also need to be patients, so individuals, consumers who are having certain medical condition which this new treatment is tested on. And just on top level financial incentives that the sponsors have, basically when sponsors are developing a new drug, they want to patent it, and usually they are filing the patent application at the very beginning of the process. And the thing is that the patents are expiring in 20 years. In the meanwhile, the average time for the R&D, new drug R&D process is 15 years. So when we do the math here, we can see that there's like roughly a 5-year time window to have the exclusivity in the marketplace for the pharmaceutical companies to sell the drug that they have just developed. So obviously they have a big incentive to get this number down, number 15 and down, and decrease the amount of time. And there's only so much they can do to really reduce the time in the scientific process. But what they can do, and what is actually the biggest thing delaying the clinical trials and the whole process, is the patient recruitment, really finding the patients who are eligible for the study, who can participate, and also the patient retention so that the patient are also staying in the study after they have enrolled. And just briefly about the participation. So when a patient is participating in a clinical trial, it's quite different from the other healthcare. It doesn't matter what kind of health insurance they have or whether they are under the public, pre-public healthcare. They are always getting the medication, investigational medication for free. That's always. And on top of that, they are also getting reimbursed for all of their study-related, participation-related expenses. So travel costs, or parking, mileage, transportation, meals, and whatnot. And it's really important then to get this payment thing right, having it efficient, because it's then part of the whole patient experience, and eventually it's also having a big impact on the patient willingness to continue in the participation in the clinical trial. So it basically, the payments, they have the direct impact, the patient experience. Like obviously patients want to have the payments in timely and a convenient manner, but it also has many indirect implications. For example, one of our studies found out that that medical staff at the sites are spending 41% of their time for different kind of administration tasks, payment processing being a big part of it. So that tells that not necessarily all of the systems that they are using are very efficient, and this time is away than the time spent with the patient. So it has big indirect impact to the patient experience down the road. There's also two more other stats I want to show you. This is showing that, oops, I don't know, sorry, I don't know what's happening in the Excel pie chart. But anyway, I'm glad that this is working well. So more than half of the patients are not getting reimbursed at every study visit, meaning that the costs are adding up. And sorry that the numbers are not shown for whatever reason, but it's also that 1/4 of the patients are getting reimbursed only once at the very end of the study. And imagining that the studies can go around and can go on for several years even. So there could be a big sum that the hospitals and the sponsors are then owing to the patient, adding obviously a lot of burden for the patients. Again, sorry about the pie chart, but this is showing that almost more than two-thirds of the patients are still getting reimbursed in very old-fashioned way, cash, checks, and money orders. It's not only inconvenient for the patients, but it's definitely not very efficient for the sites. You know, processing, running around, finding petty cash, then processing checks, and also taking the consideration of different kind of documentation and reporting requirements that the sites have. This paper stuff is not the way doing things in 2018.
Is that a reflection of a fragmented nature of the way the business works, or the parties who are involved? What would you say the reasons for that petty cash nature of it is?
Good question. I think there's a myriad of reasons. Old habits, definitely a big part of it. And I think in general for the adoption, there's different layers for the kind of gatekeepers. The first is the sponsor, the pharmaceutical companies. So it's up to them whether they are buying a new different kind of new tailored payment product for their study, or whether they are letting the sites do whatever they want to do. So that's one thing, whether there's in a given trial, whether there's a payment product available. The next layer is the site level adoption. So even though in a given trial there is a payment product available, it's then up to the sites whether they are really starting to use it. Again, it could be up to the old habits. It could be that the medical team is part of the bigger institution, bigger hospital, and they have their own hospital specific payment solution available, which may or may not be very efficient. So there's a lot of different reasons.
And again, when you're talking about a multi-site trial, it doesn't mean just multiple sites in the US.
Yes.
You can have a trial going on in 10 different countries. So it's not just the fragmented nature of the US system, but you can have a trial in Poland, in Argentina, in Mexico, Spain, in Japan. And so you've got a whole set of different causes and different currencies.
Now, Hanu, you had mentioned earlier that BBK was starting to get into the payments. What are some of the means you're using to address this?
Means? Sorry, what do you mean?
You mentioned earlier when you introduced yourself that you were starting to think and do more in the payments area. How are you starting to address this?
So we call ourselves a patient experience company. So our goal is to kind of help on the recruitment side. Like I said, our heritage is to be a marketing company, finding patients to the study, but the retention part is a big growing part that what we have been doing. So we have been looking at different ways how we can take the burden away from the both sides and the patients. So this is kind of we identified that this was a big part which is causing burden for both sides and the patients, and I guess that's kind of what lead us to investigate this area and coming up with different kind of solutions.
So here's an interesting point where it's going two different ways. In clinical trials, it's paying the patient who's actually being tested, whereas in the rest of it, it's actually the patient paying for the medical service.
Yeah, very true. Just to clarify that, it's actually reimbursement. So by the regulation, patients are not allowed to be paid for their participation, but that they are getting reimbursed for their direct expenses for their participation, travel and stuff. Yeah.
And I think something important to consider is the population of patients who are participating in this. A lot of them don't have bank accounts. They're participating in this clinical trial probably for a little bit of a financial need. So sometimes cash or a check or a money order may be best to what suits that specific patient population. And then also in terms of disengagement, there's been also just a lot of attitudes about how patients in clinical trials have been treated previously. And so I think that takes into account when you're working with certain populations, especially why they may be disengaged. You know, it takes time for someone to go to the clinical site. Some of these people may not have a car, they may be spending money to participate in that, and in the long term, it may not be beneficial for them to continue being in the study if the payout isn't until later.
Yeah, that's a good point. Although I think that those kind of cash and checks, I think they are impacting the stat so that they are inefficient for the sites. So it means that they are not, patients are not necessarily getting paid after each visit. So it's adding up the costs that, or the money that the patients should get, receivables. I can show you, I have actually one more slide. So just to get an idea about the products which are out there, BBK, yeah, this is the solution. We are not the only company who is offering this kind of product, but we are amongst the ones who have developed a specific product for the clinical trial payments. So just in a nutshell, this is a Visa card. So patients don't need to have a bank account to really receive the money. They can use the Visa card wherever Visa is working. They also do have an option to set up the automatic payments directly to their bank account if they want. So it's convenient for the patients. And for the sites, we are offering our online portal, a proprietary online portal. So basically sites are just logging in, they are entering the payments, and it's literally like 1 or 2 minutes, and money is going to the patient card, and everything is everything is done. And because everything is happening digitally, it's also tackling the reporting and the documentation requirements right away. Again, this is one of the products which is in the marketplace, and there's a couple of competitors having a similar type of approach. But maybe to sum this up, there are products in the marketplace, but going to my previous slides, referring to my previous slides, there's still some work to be done that this is really coming more mainstream.
Yeah. How long has it been in the market for?
I think since 2014.
Okay, you guys have had this available since 2014?
Yes.
Okay.
4 or 5 years.
So what's been the impact on the trials that you've worked with? What's been the impact on patient retention and on site retention?
Good question. So it's actually surprisingly a big impact that we have been seeing across the board that these type of payment products do have. One of the KPIs, key performance indicators that we are using is to look at the patient withdrawal rates. Obviously, withdrawal rate is the percentage of the patients who withdrew from the study before completing it. And when we do the comparison between our product users and non-users, we can see that the withdrawal rates are on average 55% lower amongst the patients who are using this kind of a payment product. So considering that every single patient is precious, and also considering that the time delays it causes to find a new patient to replace the current one, and also the cost, sometimes it could be very difficult to find a new patient. We could need to run some new advertising, additional advertising and outreach efforts. So it's definitely a cost and time effort, which is having even one withdrawal may cost. Sir?
Hi, is RSG using the Visa digital disbursement platform to fund the card account for the patient reimbursement?
So we are having our proprietary online portal, which is used for this. So basically, it's a site-facing. Sites are logging in, and they are using. Obviously, we do have some APIs with that, but yeah, it's basically the front end is our proprietary portal.
Do you have to integrate with the practice management or EHR software that the clinic or hospital is using, or they input the information directly to there?
We don't need to actually do that. The thing is that the funding is coming from the sponsor, so we just need to kind of integrate the funds with the sponsor, and we are taking care of that.
So I was just going to ask, internationally, are you seeing more utility of mobile payments? and versus, traditional prepaid cards or debit products, which you'd see maybe in the United States? Is that fair?
I think it's fair. Yeah, maybe it's fair. I think like US is definitely, we still love checks here quite a bit. So yeah, I think there's certain differences.
Yes, that's it. But how did BBK, what technologies did you have, and how did you get through the regulatory regime of so many different countries?
Good question. Obviously, different kind of data privacy things are, hot topic. GDPR was introduced earlier this year. We have HIPAA compliant, regulations in the healthcare space. So I think we are here to talk about the payments and the healthcare, and I think those are amongst the most regulated industries when it comes to data management and data sensitivity. So we do have, I think one of the bigger things is that you just need to allocate resources to do that compliance work, whether it's internal team, whether it's external consultants, whether it's a combination of both. So I think kind of sounds simple or simple to say, but I think we don't really have any other option than being compliant for all of the regulations. And I'm sure that my fellow panelists will agree when operating in space. So our clients just need to trust in that. Again, it's simple to say. World is much more complex, but I'm not necessarily an expert when it comes to compliance, but anyway, our approach is that our compliance team is typically trying to look for what is the most strict regulation, and then make sure that we are compliant with that, and then not necessarily making like a country-specific adaptations, but kind of roll out all of the different changes that we make based on the regulation, like in different countries. So, for example, in GDPR, we didn't make updates only for the Europe, but we also made it like for other reasons, like South America and North America and Asia.
Sometimes in the case of very rare diseases, you see patients being flown from one country to another. How does this system work for that kind of travel and expense?
Great question. This product is, I think this is ideal when the patient is living in the same city where they are participating in the trial. They are taking an Uber to the hospital and maybe having a meal there. So the reimbursement sum is in a couple of tens of bucks. But it's actually quite common that clinical trial patients need to travel across the country or even across the globe, especially with the rare diseases. So we actually do also have a travel product called RSG Arrive. It's complementary product with the card. So they work very well in hand. So in a nutshell, Arrive works so that we are taking care of all of the travel arrangements for the patients, paying everything up front, whether it's hotels, flights, ground transportation. If needed, we have been also doing some visa support. We have been adding a translator to travel with the patients, so it also goes beyond the actual payment. But paying everything up front via that service is definitely a huge deal for the patients, so that there's no money going from their own pocket.
So yeah, that was the question I had for the regular service you give. We were also talking about it. Jeffrey was mentioning that predicting the expenses beforehand could help this system, and especially with this kind of payments where it's probably even easier to predict because it's about expenses that the customer does, the patient does to get to the hospital or have some food there. So why is there a model, first of all, in your system that is kind of predicted prepay, and then the customer gets reimbursed for the rest?
So you don't have to go out of pocket. So you don't have to go out of pocket, you get reimbursed in advance.
Or you minimize the risk of the out-of-pocket.
Yeah.
And then maybe that gets reimbursed at the end of the study or every next month, something like that. which would really ease the system?
So basically, actually, it's happening, I think, a little more even upstream. So it's basically in the very beginning of the study that we really sit down with the study sponsor, and because eventually they are the ones who are funding all of this, and we are then having certain algorithms to calculate that whether it's a rare disease, whether we are expecting a lot of cross-country or international travel, or whether it's like some trial where we are expecting that patients can be found in the same city where their sites are located. So it's basically happening very upfront with the sponsor, and then just making sure that there's enough funds available for the patients, and then it's basically the responsibilities on sites to make sure that the patients are getting timely payments.
So yeah, I mean, the prediction is already being done, is what I'm hearing, obviously, because the sponsor has to know what kind of fund he needs to put into this. So then why not also do the payment upfront, like in a regular interval, right? Whatever the interval of the treatment is.
Yeah, that's
monthly.
Yeah, that's a good comment. Although I think it's also regulated by the regulation that it needs to be a reimbursement. It's not a prepayment.
Yeah, it's just maybe there's a gray area there because you're doing like the hotel or travel payments of the, travel version of this upfront. Obviously not to the patient, so I understand the difference there.
Yeah, sometimes there could be that the sponsors are defining a certain fixed sum that it's $50 per each study visit, and if the patients spend only $10, good for them, they get like $40 extra. It could happen, but I think it's a little bit more common than to have it like make the reimbursement based on the receipts available.
So if I'm misunderstanding, maybe, but if I was a patient, aren't I still collecting a lot of pieces of paper? Aren't I still collecting a lot of receipts that I have to then present?
So by the book, you need to print the receipts to get the reimbursement. But then again, it's usually happening. It's only directly related costs. So usually those are happening only at the same day when you are going actually to the study visit. So it's not that you need to keep them in the books for several weeks. It's usually happening. You take a taxi or take a flight in the morning and go to the study site. So it's the same thing.
I'm still going to take a taxi home. So am I sending an expense report? How am I proving to you that you owe me $35? Because I know in another business that I'm in, which is events, that's a very, very time consuming after process, which is paying everybody back with all of their receipts, and everything is paper.
Well, there are digital solutions out there for the expense thing, corporate solutions like Concur. Take photos and log it all on their phone.
And I think our similarity is that we're all freelancers, which is the equivalent of a group of patients which have no connection.
Which is another whole topic. I was at an event 2 mornings ago about the future of work, which has to do with freelancing, which is a whole nother topic. So anyway.
So I guess down that vein, was there ever any thought into making this a credit card where then they don't have to pay the out-of-pocket expense up front and then it gets reimbursed once it's kind of the expenses submitted?
Like I said, I think the nature is that it needs to be reimbursement.
Right.
But the thing is that we usually recommend using our trial program when we are talking about bigger sums. So when we go beyond a couple of tens of bucks, we definitely recommend using our trial service.
I feel like a lot of that also, you were mentioning patients withdrawing from a clinical trial. I feel like that's also something that you guys would keep in mind, because if you do that prepayment that you said beforehand, or that idea of a credit card, like saying you have X amount of dollars that this is what we're paying you, reimbursing you for. So what is to say that they're not going to withdraw 2 days from that? So I feel like that having that in mind also is kind of the idea of having that reimbursement, the reimbursement after that action is taken.
Yeah, I don't disagree.
So I want to shift a little bit. Jeff, because you're on the Secure Technology Alliance's Health and Human Services Council, and David and Henry, you are consulting with a lot of different companies. How is the industry coping with some of the issues that get raised? Portability of medical records, identity protection from identity theft. What kind of initiatives are you seeing taken, and what is the industry doing as a whole to kind of move this along?
So I'll comment on identity first. I think there's some really interesting things that are occurring, particularly right now, relative to identity. I always like to kind of tell the story as best I know it. So dating back, I think, to 1999, someone slipped a one-word sentence into the fiscal budget that said, "We will not have a national patient identifier." And that sentence has sat in the federal budget for the last 17 or 18 years.
What was the genesis of it? You know who did it and what we can do about it?
I think they've been voted out of office now, so that's the first step, right, to making that change. I don't know the whole backstory.
Probably cheap, but that seems like a foolish thing to put in. I'm wondering, clearly someone paid the guy or lobbied the guy to do it.
Sure, something that was slipped in there, right? So the House has actually started to really take this up and look at national patient identifier. In fact, they passed a House resolution just a few months ago. It was really the first step in allowing the government to assess and analyze the effectiveness of what a national patient identifier would do for Medicare, Medicaid, and then ultimately the private sector. So now that we've got this first step in place, there's a number of folks in that particular space who are extremely excited about the future and the potential for that, because there's a lot of benefits that we'll reap from that. And some of the benefits could be the portability of health records, right? I was going to comment earlier, just briefly, and a couple of individuals raised this. There's a great story on GDPR on 60 Minutes Sunday. And I think healthcare records are similar to that, right? So in Europe, they're basically saying you own your data, right, about you. And so that's, while that hasn't come to the U.S., there's all sorts of, I'm not educated on it, but arguments and conversations that are happening about that. It should be the same thing with your patient records. We should be asking, how do I get access to my patient records? How do I get control of my patient records? That if I need them, when I'm traveling in New York City, I'm from Dallas, and if I have a medical incident here in New York City, if I have my patient records on my mobile phone via a national identifier that I can walk into a facility with a mobile wallet, present that, authenticate my identity, and those records can now be distributed to that patient care organization, how much more powerful would that be for my process of care, right? So I think there's a tremendous amount of benefits for me as a patient if we can move in that direction. There's also benefits for the hospital system, because they might have 40 instances of me in their Epic system, in their master patient index file, just because someone misspelled my name, right? And instead of the U, there's no U, and it's
So even within the same system.
Yeah, there could be
same
40
software. There's no incentive to purge, clean up, do a merge purge kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, again, that's probably a whole topic into itself, right? But I think that's one of the benefits of moving down this national patient identifier route is we can gain control of our records, and we can own those, and we can distribute those as we see fit. And then there's benefits for the care providers as well.
How much cost do you think that could bring out of the system? Duplicate tests, drug mistakes, and clearance?
Yeah, so for the federal government to act on it, it has to impact the federal budget. And there's estimates and studies that show us $60 billion in Medicare fraud.
That's B with a billion, right?
B with a billion that are a result of, now fraud is a broad topic. I'm not going to sit here and say that it's all related to identity. But if we can secure your identity and if we can gain better control of that identity, then it's certainly going to make it harder for the thieves to access my mom's information and replicate that and present that to someone, through yourself or through another female, right? So getting to that identifier system can strip a lot of that cost out of the Medicare system. And so that's one of the numbers that's thrown out there. On the private side, I don't think they've quite quantified exactly what that means.
So we're talking a little bit now about macro level things that could affect the medical system. And political shifts have had something to do with it over the last 15 years. We just saw some other changes that may affect that. But what I've been curious about, and I'd love to get your opinion, is when you had Berkshire Hathaway and Chase and Amazon go together and to go Atul Gawande, who I always thought was a good thinker, and put him in charge of it. Now, there's a lot of money there. That's not enough bodies to move the needle itself. But one of my thoughts, and I'd love to ask people who are in the business, was that if they come up with standards and enforce them, that they could propagate. Any thoughts on, because we have a screwed up system, there's too many pieces, there's little standardization. With something like that, could it have a major significant effect?
I think you're right. I think it's going to start with those three companies. Now they probably employ, whatever it was, 3 or 4 million people. So it's a pretty good, test case, lab test to test. I mean, you've got competency with Berkshire on insurance, and you've got competency with JP Morgan around payments, and you've got competency with Amazon around consumerism and transparency and choice. So who knows how it's going to shake out, but Google's doing the same thing. Google just appointed the former head or the current president of Geisinger Healthcare to run their initiative. So the challenge with a lot of initiatives in the United States is that you've got a very commercial free market approach, which is great in many ways, but I don't think there's necessarily going to be one standard that just emanates from this Berkshire thing. I think it's going to be an innovation lab for a couple of years, but I don't see something coming from this organization.
How about growth of Medicaid in America? We've seen just in the last election, just some states passing. That's a good thing to do. Do you see that? I mean, there's the biggest single payer in the country. Is there any future for that kind of enforcing with compelling more standardization?
Well, Medicaid's operating at the state level, though. I mean, it's block grant funded by the federal government, matched, but it's still a state level program, and that that contributes to the fractionalization of the.
So there's consistency between different Medicaid in different states. They're not consistent.
Every state has its own Medicaid.
Okay, so there's no standardization that could become at a national level from that.
It'd probably be more than Medicare.
Medicare,
than Medicaid.
Yeah, Medicare.
I mean, the federal government is an enforcer from the financing standpoint because they do. But I don't think they're going to hold that hostage, the Medicaid funding hostage, to states not following through on some. Who knows? I mean, we stopped funding highways if we didn't raise the drinking age to 21. So the federal government has at least a history of that kind of enforcement. But
it would have to be a different government.
I mean, there's just so many topics we can cover when we get to that kind of macro level.
Yeah, well, I'm just wondering,
healthcare.
A lot of it we're talking about the low level, all the problems at a micro level, and is there any hope of something at a bigger level that would be happening?
Yeah, I mean, I'd be interested in just some questions.
Well, I think to answer your question, CMS is trying to push through that through the 21st Century Act.
Remember, you give us CMS.
Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. And so they've come out and said the information is being essentially blocked from being shared throughout the healthcare industry, much to everyone's detriment. And they want to stop it. And they're trying to put in regulations that requires these platforms, these EHRs, Epics, and Cerners of the world to actually create open APIs, standardized to a framework that the industry has agreed is the way forward, and so now it's just about enforcing that and getting momentum.
So what, they don't have any enforcement power, it's just suasion?
The law. So
okay.
21st Century Act is a law passed that has a rule in it around what it means to actually share data effectively. And that's being worked through the committees right now, and it's supposed to be in public comment in the next few months.
Okay.
And then we'll see what happens.
Yeah, I mean, there's a history here. If you go back to the High Tech Act, when basically the government invested in electronic medical records, and they basically, for lack of a better term, I don't think it's quite accurate, but forced every healthcare provider essentially to implement an electronic medical record and move off the paper. And that took, I don't know, 7 years. I mean, I think that was part of it.
It's strong to say it was forced.
And I think so there's a model, and so I think all they're doing is they're building on that model that they implemented, goodness, what, 2008,
they finally started
and so now they're expanding on that and focusing on interoperability, and that's the buzzword in the industry. How do we make things more shareable across platforms so that you can truly own your record?
You've got electronic medical records here. They have them in Europe. You've got HIPAA here, the go back and I've looked this one up. Health insurance portability and accountability act, and that's privacy. And you've got the new European Union's general data protection regulations. How does that all interact with electronic medical records, portability, a patient owning its own data with a patient medical wallet? How, is there any way that you can sync that all up?
Yeah, let's come back to that for a minute. I mean, there are really two P's in HIPAA, even though it only has one P in the acronym. Most people spell it right, but you'll see it sometimes with two P's. It's actually got two A's. Portability and privacy are the two P's. And there's been almost 100% focus on the privacy P for the last 20 years. But there's actually a component of that act which was intended to promote the portability of your record as well. And it has just been completely lost. It really is not in the business interest of a health system. You have to think about this for a minute. But it is not in the business interest of a health system to give you your information because they don't want you to leave the four walls of the health system. I mean, it's hard to talk about it this way, but health systems actually, even though a lot of them are set up as not-for-profit entities, are trying to make money, and they don't want to lose their patients. So if they give you...
It's like open banking, where they've said that banks have to be able to share customer information, but that was compelled, whereas this...
Well, there's a financial incentive, like come back to what I was talking about before with financial incentives. If you're going to go to somebody else's ATM to take money out, it's going to cost you money. Your bank charges and that bank in the system charges. So there's a lot more built-in, kind of financial incentives for banking to allow that to happen. My point, though, is that within HIPAA, and just generally within what we just referred to as a high-tech act, or what was generally called the stimulus, kind of law back in 2009, there was a lot about just getting the health record systems in place. Now, what's happening is a focus on interoperability. And we'll see. I mean, the government is at it again to try to force something. We'll see whether they actually have any of the mechanisms that they would need to make that happen. But I think to the questions in here about kind of what's it going to take, I actually think that about the only entity in the U.S. that can make this happen is CMS, is Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services. In some way, shape, or form, trying to force through some national patient identifier.
I'm kind of dumb on this. What kind of entity is that? Is that a quasi-governmental entity or whatever?
CMS reports up through Health and Human Services, so it's it's one level down from Health and Human Services, and so Health and Human Services is a cabinet level position.
Got it.
And then below that is CMS. CMS has its own administrator, which is an incredibly powerful position in the U.S. government.
So is it subject then to all the so would a change in administration, for example, the last few years, has that affected the ability of it to act depending?
It does affect because it's an appointed position. CMS administrator is an appointed position, and whoever is in that position is an appointee of usually the current administration.
So they have rules, but they can choose not to enforce.
It's like all of the things that we deal with right now that's on the executive branch. Exactly, there's a lot of kind of interpretation in terms of execution of the law.
So the tools are there depending on who wants to use them and how they work.
Jeff, is the
Please others chime in. I mean, this is, partly.
Jeff, is the council weighing in on this, or what is the council doing in this area?
Well, the Health and Human Services Council for the Secure Technology Alliance, I think used to saying that as well, is focused probably in two areas primarily. One is securing patient payments, and the second is this concept of patient identity. So we're advocating, our government officials. We're partnering with a number of other similar alliance groups that have the same mission and the same focus to get the message out, educate the marketplace, present white papers, present solutions, speak at different engagements, but most importantly, just simply lobby, because we fundamentally believe the same thing that David shared, is that CMS ultimately holds the trump card. If they want to place the trump card on the table, then they can get it done.
For at least 2 more years.
Oh, yes, thank you. Sorry, I did not mean that.
The pun is always intended.
Jeff, could you talk a little bit about some of the commercial efforts to sort of promulgate interoperability, like the Commonwealth, which is different from the Commonwealth Health Advisors, and where they may have fallen short, and what's happening now with the Advisory Council?
Yeah, and would love, some of your perspective as well. Certainly there's some groups out there that are trying to promote interoperability. You mentioned Commonwealth. Unfortunately, one of the major players is not participating in that which is also a personal opinion of mine, why I think the government has looked at that and said, well, the private sector hasn't figured out how to do it themselves together, so let's figure out how to do it for them. Right, I think they allowed a few years to go by.
Who was missing?
Epic chose to either form their own alliance or go their own way.
Epic thinks that it's actually going to have the master patient identifier when all is said and done.
So I think
finding things up in Madison, Wisconsin.
Yeah, certainly. So I think that's presented a significant challenge. Is you've got a body trying to accomplish a certain set of objectives, but you've got one of the major players not participating in that. So ultimately, we can all debate the effectiveness of those groups, to this point in time.
Unless you have universal participation, they're kind of not going to get it done.
Yeah. One thing that I would add is that actually there are a lot of standards already to exchange financial information within the healthcare system. There's, the claims processing world has been developing and adopting standards actually for years and doing it pretty well. I mean, there was kind of a rocky transition from ICD-9 to ICD-10, which is the system that we use to determine how a claim should be coded for reimbursement purposes. But there are a bunch of standards that are used within the financial side. A lot of what we're referring to here in terms of interoperability or the lack of exchange of health information is on the clinical side. You getting or a patient getting their own clinical information, which is labs and measures and doctor's notes and diagnoses and all those kinds of things that make up the body of your real health record.
To that, can you get back to, say, the commercial side and the CMS effort to do the test around the reimbursement for the lower extremity procedures and paying the hospital and then having the hospital pay all the pre and post care providers?
Are you referring to bundled payments?
I guess that's what it is.
Yeah. So one of the things that CMS is trying to do, but that has to do with more of a reimbursement mechanism as opposed to the rails in payments, is just this is all about value-based care. If folks are kind of generally familiar with the idea of paying for outcomes, we were talking about this a little bit before, as opposed to just paying a fee for services provided, which is we generally call that paying for volume, as opposed to paying for value. So the bundled payment system is set up mostly for joints, total joints, and there's a couple of other areas that fall into that today, but it's really an attempt to allow the hospital to take on risk, or whoever is doing that to take on risk. And they get to determine who does the procedures, what are the supporting services, what the facilities are, and they manage the post-discharge care as well, so that the patient, if they actually get readmitted, the hospital's on the hook, or if there's post-care required, how quickly does the patient go to rehab, all of these kinds of things, what regimens do they follow, what treatment protocols. The hospital should make those decisions in a way that provides the best care at the lowest possible price, and the bundled payment is the way to help move that along. It's really in line with the whole idea of capitation back in the old days of managed care, where you just give a global payment for the patient and let the healthcare entity figure out how to provide that care, which works across the population. The idea of the bundle payment is for episodic care. The one thing I will say about the private sector working with our own health information is what Apple is doing with Apple Health and allowing your data to transport from your health record at whatever entity has that data today. That's, to my mind, fairly profound. Some might say that it's Apple's marketing machine, working its magic. I don't know. I mean, jury's out, but Apple is allowing you, if you have an iPhone, obviously Android's, not in that ecosystem. So if you have an iPhone, you can, if your health system permits it, and mine does, I'm with Partners at Mass General up in Boston, I can suck my data into my phone. So it sits right here. There's going to be a whole ecosystem of developers that are going to be permitted, with my permission, to begin to do things with my data. So I actually really do own my data, and I will allow people to use it, whether they can monetize it for some general societal benefit or for my benefit, or it's just an app that works just for me. That's actually a big change. It's starting from what we've known up to this point.
So ethically, how will that play out with responsible parties? So let's say, a child. Will a parent be able to do that with their children's data? And ethically, should they?
I don't know.
I've just been given the signal that we're pretty much out of time. So do each of you have kind of a final comment? Let's start with Jeff.
Oh goodness, I think a final comment would be just the opportunity that's in healthcare. We talked about so many problems right here, and there's so many startups we've all found to solve these different problems, right? I think that's what's so intriguing. That's why I'm in this space. That's why I'm passionate about this space. I think there's so many challenges that we can tackle.
Yeah, the one thing I would touch on is simply the idea of patient financial engagement or consumer financial engagement, whatever you want to call it. We hardly touched on that tonight. To me, to us at Commonwealth, Henry and I spend a lot of our time in this area now. There's a lot of capital flowing into this space, mostly because people see a lot of opportunity to address an issue, which is the increasing amount of the payment that is now the responsibility of the patient. We're not going to be able to have patients pick money off a tree, obviously, unfortunately. But when patients do get hit with medical bills, I think one of the things that we see happening is a lot more ways to help patients understand those bills, manage those bills, and hopefully ultimately, pay those bills.
Probably for financial incentives, probably financing incentives there, and that's where a lot of revenue potential is. If you can help people understand and give them the financing options, since you're not going to fix the cost of rising medical costs directly, but you can help people manage it.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's happening is medical debt is emerging as an asset class. So you will find financial institutions packaging medical debt and selling it as a instrument.
Henry, before you come with your last thing, I'm just going to work on what David said. If we could use the electronic systems to start to wring some of the excess cost out of the system, how would this then build on what David said? So if we're lowering cost, do we start to lower the cost to patients? And it will be then easier to collect.
Helping people pay the cost, lowering the cost is a separate thing, but.
Well, bringing costs out with the electronics, so there is excess cost in the system that you could wring out using some of our advanced technologies.
I just think it's unlikely that EDI and electronic payment, growth is going to be a benefit that's passed on to the consumer at lower prices. I think the hospitals.
Has that ever happened in the past?
Yeah, not really. I think the hospitals are going to book that as a small win that they get in terms of operating margin. But just going to my point or observation, I think you're going to see the hospitals as sort of a fortress organization, and we've seen this already. It's going to become less and less important for where we all get care. It's going to be in the community. It's going to be urgent care. It's going to be ambulatory surgical centers. It's going to be telemedicine.
Worksite care.
Teledoc is for real. 2 weeks ago, the Center for Medicare Services said, that's a real visit. You have a telemedicine visit with a patient, that's real thing. And reimbursable. So you're going to see just the way care is delivered. Now, hospitals are going to be smart about it, and they're going to sort of start to acquire these things and start to brand them as their own. So as consumers have more choice, they still have more, branded care delivery outposts that are theirs. But the consumer is not going to say, I got to go to the hospital for this. That notion that's been sort of in our head for years is really evaporating. Hospitals and health systems are going to need to figure out, we talked about this earlier, are going to need to figure out what their loyalty mechanism is with their patient. It goes back to David's comment about patient financial engagement. I would not be surprised if you start to see, NYU, Cornell medical credit cards, branded cards that, just like you see branded affinity credit cards with airlines and hotels and others, that you can start to see, hospitals realize that they have to engage in the consumers in a loyalty relationship that's much different than it's ever been in the past.
I have one question on the issue of consumer education. Don't you think it's relevant that real-time adjudication come to fruition to be able to help that process? Because unless you know what to expect, it's difficult to anticipate some of that. So it becomes more difficult to educate that patient in that process. And that's always been the payer side issue. Nobody wants to seem to step up to the plate as a group, if you will.
We could talk about that for a long time. I mean, we're having a sidebar conversation with one of our former colleagues from Athena who's here tonight. Athena had the ability on its side to do this a while back, and it's really held up on the payer side.
If I just may submit, I think there's even a more fundamental issue around providers not really understanding what their costs are and how much it actually costs them to deliver services in any bucket you want to pick. And Price Waterhouse and Kaiser, and there's been books written on this, really get at the fundamental issue that until the providers really understand what their costs are, how can the consumer actually understand what their cost is? So on top of all of this, fundamentally, you're going to have some potential populist pushback that says once Mr. and Mrs. Sausage Head wakes up and sees what they're really on the hook for, they're gonna fight back and say, hey, this
Well,
isn't fair. Why is Medicare getting reimbursed $12 and you're asking me to pay $300? You know, there's a fundamental disconnect, and until that gets addressed from a COGS issue, everything else is just gonna be talk, and then ultimately we'll get to the bottom line.
So Hanno, final comment from you.
So at least in the clinical trial space, I think there's a lot of discussion and excitement around the innovation, but it's kind of a paradox because I feel that, and I think that when it really comes down to introducing something new in that space, it's also that the next question that you usually get is that, sorry, is this mic working? Can you hear me?
Yes.
So usually the next question you get is that, okay, can you show me the data that this is working? But if something is totally new, you don't necessarily have that data from the last couple of years. So it's a paradox, and it's also kind of a business cycle as well. But at the same time, I think it's also a lot of movement around the patient centricity and patient experience. I know they sound like the buzzwords, but I think that the industry is really moving in that direction, that they're starting to at least trying to live up those words and really moving at least the right direction. Pace might be slow, but the direction is right.
So I want to thank you all for coming. I want to thank you for being a really engaged audience, and my thanks to Henry and Hannah and David and Jeff.
Thank you very, very much.
And for all their travel.
For hosting. And stay in touch because we're in December, we're going to be thinking about topics for the next quarter. We want to get 3 or 4 up on the board. And clearly there's going to be another specific section of this we got there. It's gone for a long time. Thank you very, very much. Sorry to run out of here.
Yeah, likewise. Enjoyed it.